Welcome to Broadcasting Common Ground, the Deep Foundation Institute's podcast channel. In this series, DFI's Rumble, we will be speaking with opposing industry representatives, asking hard questions and facilitating a polite argument. In this episode, Numerical Modeler versus Skeptic, Augusto Lucarelli will be representing Numerical Modelers and Brian Anderson will be representing Skeptics. Sponsored by ECA.
Welcome to DFI's podcast, Broadcasting Common Ground. I'm Lucky Nagarajan, and welcome to Rumble, where we ask two guests to enter the arena and go toe-to-toe on topics relevant to our industry. The referee facilitates the discussion. In this episode, Tim Siegel referees the discussion between Augusto Lucarelli, principal engineer with Itasca Consulting Group, and Dr. Brian Anderson, associate professor at Auburn University. Tim, can you give us a hint of what is in store for us?
Lucky, in this episode of Rumble, we're going to hear from a numerical modeler and a skeptic. Here's a look at our ticket. In one corner, we've got Augusto Lucarelli. He splits his time between Italy and the United States. His specialty is the finite difference software FLAC, or its three-dimensional counterpart FLAC 3D. Needless to say, Augusto is our numerical modeler. In the other corner is Dr. Brian Anderson. Brian is an associate professor in geotechnical engineering at Auburn University in Alabama. We have asked Brian, and he has accepted, to play the part of a skeptic, a cynic, a doubter, if you will. We are very grateful for these two geotechnical experts for their willingness to join our podcast.
Thank you, Tim. That's wonderful. And thanks to Augusto and Brian. I'm sure it's going to be a treat for us. Thank you. Take it away, Tim.
Let me remind our audience that we have 3 rounds. We have asked our contestants to be respectful, which I'm certain they will. I will make sure each guest has a chance to speak. All right, everybody, when you hear the bell, let's come out swinging. All right. Welcome, Augusto and Brian. Let me start on the side of numerical modeling. Augusto, in terms of use and advancements, numerical modeling, and more precisely, numerical modeling software, has greatly outpaced other parts of our industry. We still use the standard penetration test. We still use Atterberg limits. But we have extremely complex numerical modeling software, and they are constantly improved and updated. Why do you think this is the situation?
It's a great starting question. On one side, I would say that the fact that we still use the SPT, for example, as a soil investigation tool, that, as we know, is not the best tool that we can implement in many situations. Doesn't make it up and doesn't justify that we should still use, subpar numerical or analysis tools in general. And I would rather think about this in terms of numerical analysis in general as a tool inside our toolbox instead of specific aspect of each software. Because that is a secondary, it's just a detail, but let's think about the framework of the numerical analysis. Even if we have, and I do rely on Atterberg limit or SPT, even to set up, especially Atterberg limit. Let's think about a landslide in which you have to investigate the distribution of properties, and Atterberg limit is a very convenient and easy way to come up with, residual, estimate of residual or fully softened or peak strength using literature correlation. So as a first pass, it's a very useful tool. But this doesn't mean that we have to rely on simplistic or simplified analysis only. The numerical analysis in my opinion, is a great tool to investigate and to expand the unknown. I know that I don't know. Okay, and the numerical tool, numerical analysis is a great tool to assess what matters in that circumstance. Is the stiffness of the micropile, is the relative stiffness of these two layers that they're controlling, how the cap beam is controlling the formation, what is the cinematic of the system as a whole, what is the hierarchical failure once we get there. All these questions are, let's say, fundamental to try to understand what is the risks, what is the, let's say, the best approach that we can implement, and also to provide, let's say, a full spectrum of the behavior of the solution that we're trying to implement.
I like that, Augusto. I see where you're going. We're going to circle back to that, but I think what I hear you saying is that you like to see, and correct me if I'm wrong, you like to see numerical modeling as a tool in the toolbox. And one of the things that it can do that perhaps the standard penetration test or Atterberg limits, while they do what they do very well, but numerical modeling helps you expand and test hypotheticals and let you see how things react. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes.
Is the proper place for numerical modeling?
I don't see the numerical modeling as a deterministic tool. I don't need to have, and we will never have the perfect data set where we know everything. And so only in that circumstance, we should use numerical modeling, because we know 15 parameters of X and Y constitutive model, and that is the perfect setup for a constitutive model. No.
Well, let's circle back. Let me get Brian in here, but we're going to circle back to that, because I think that's a very interesting distinction that we really, through this show, should make it clear. Okay, Brian, on to you. Kind of reverting back to the original question, and talking about the rise in numerical modeling, certainly compared to other technical aspects of our industry. Are there other reasons you think that it's grown other than on its technical merits?
Well, I grew up watching Hanna-Barbera and the Jetsons, and think about George Jetson. At some point, his career was pushing a button all day long, just one button. And that's what, in some ways.
Sometimes I feel like I'm George Jetson.
So we're becoming a culture that wants to push buttons all day and not think. So that's, I've grown up, my academic career has been with the rise of finite element and numerical software. And you begin to see that with as much as we teach it, and as much as our students are exposed to it, they begin to reach for that tool first in the toolbox. Every problem starts to look like a nail when your favorite tool is a hammer. So I do see the growth, and also pacing with the fact our computing capabilities double every 6 months. That's how computing has expanded. So we get more powerful processors and computers, and the software gets more fancy, and we get better user interfaces. It becomes very easy to choose that tool first. It's just like all of us are guilty of picking up a calculator to add 2 + 2. I can do that in my head, but we fall into these patterns where we start to choose an advanced tool when a very simple solution may have been the controlling factor. So I think we're losing some trust in our own abilities. We're going to where we first go to a solution that a computer is providing to us computationally, rather than maybe sitting down and thinking. So going back to that, I think it's, like I said, Hanna-Barbera may have predicted the future, that we're pushing buttons all day long. But I do see us going that way. We're very comfortable. Most of us now have a computer, at least one at our desk, and we're constantly interfacing with the computer. So it's very easy to fall into that pattern rather than pulling out a sheet of paper and working your way through the problem. So,
okay. Well, you didn't go necessarily where I thought you were going to go with that, but I see that as a good point. And, the idea that when you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and certainly with the young folks coming out of school, they're probably well educated on whether it's any software and perhaps numerical modeling being the most flexible. And if they can adapt it, that especially the young folks, they can see how quickly and easily they can build a mesh. But let me shift our discussion just a little bit. It seems in our society that the most recent finding seems to be the most correct. And I'll give you guys an example. I remember when I was a kid, eggs were a no-no. You did not want to eat eggs, too high in cholesterol, really bad for you. Of course, the generation before me, that's all they ate for breakfast was eggs and bacon. Now we're kind of back to where it's saying eggs are good for you. But it seemed like even in medicine, the latest and greatest is the most correct. And in fact, it can cancel any of the previous knowledge we have. Brian, I'll ask you, has numerical modeling kind of benefited from just being the latest and greatest, kind of being always updated and brand new in our industry and therefore more believable to clients?
I mean, sure. We're all in business. It's a product. You are going to develop and make it shinier and newer and update it such that it does become the tool of choice. I mean, when was the last time you got a brand new slope stability program that you were excited about? When was the last time they updated CBEAR for bearing capacity? That was in the 80s.
Right. So, I remember CBEAR. Yeah, that was a Corps of Engineers.
So we don't see these updates. So sure, I think there's a boost, but I personally think it goes back to the massive increase in computing capability, whether now it's going from PC to the cloud, and where does that take us? Now, I do think that numerical modeling has had quite a day in the sun for maybe 20 years. We are moving towards big data solutions now too, which may be a different thing. And universities are pushing AI as well. I mean, your kids are learning AI in university now. So it might be, we are seeing a shift, but I do think we have, being the latest and greatest, it's been taking something to market that people want to update and they're willing to invest in. I'm sure that there's been a pretty big boost for numerical codes, numerical softwares that are commercialized. So,
sure. Okay. So I'm going to go back to Augusto. He's been very patient. And Augusto, and I'm going to ask you a difficult question, but I'm not asking about your company specifically, but just in general. Do you think that overall numerical modeling and its results, do they get a intrinsic credibility by being, let's just say, the most sophisticated that is typically out there, the latest and greatest? Do you think that's a factor? And maybe the question should be, and maybe there's a difference between Italy and the United States or different parts of the world. What do you think about that?
It's unarticulated. So let me start. First of all, as I was saying earlier, I know that I don't know. And my starting point is always that the more I use it, the more I go and get older, the more realize that I know very little. So the starting point is be humble. Even if you use the greatest tool should be at your service, not the other way around. There is a place and time for every tool, and this is not a substitute for our brain. Okay, you should still be able to pull up a piece of paper, write an equation on a piece of paper, and then outline, let's say, the fundamentals of the fact that you want to investigate. You should outline what data set do you have. You should outline the strategy that you are following. You should outline the uncertainty. So there is a flow, a logic, and you have to rely on the scientific method in general. Be skeptic is fundamental in our work. I've been kind of classified as a believer. The only thing that I believe is the scientific method. I don't believe in the results that I get on the first pass. Actually, I do tons and tons of sensitivity analysis and changing parameters and see what would happen in different scenarios. But I do have problems when we try to force ultra simplistic tool believing that they're going to provide the right answer when they're not capable of doing so. For example, if I have a foundation, a simple footing on a sand, do I really need to use a flat 3D model? Probably not. I can just write an equation, write the bearing capacity, an Excel spreadsheet is more than enough. Do I have a pile group on a slope with a landslide? Do I need to probably start thinking about numerical modeling? Maybe yes, because there's a complex interaction that I'm not capable of. I'm not smart enough to see where the potential failure would go and what would be the mechanism that is mobilized. Let's put it even further. Let's have a system in which I have ground improvement with inclusion. I have a retaining wall with geogrid. One system deform at 0.1% and is already break. The other system deform at 10% and is not even mobilized at full strength. What I'm going to do in between? How can I apply methods that are relying only on forces without considering any deformation whatsoever and thinking that I'm doing a right analysis? So what I'm trying to say, without picking on any type of software or any solution, but we need to be aware of the limitation of each tool that we are using in a critical manner. And there is a time and place for everything. Obviously, I rely on numerical analysis because I'm using that all the time, probably even for simplistic problem. But the mental aspect, the attitude is always, the old school type of approach, just different tool.
Excellent, Augusto. Thank you. Okay, we're getting near the end of this round, and I'm going to ask you both the same question. Do you see that engineers could prepare a numerical model and not understand the fundamental aspects involved? If the answer is yes, what does that mean for our industry? Brian, I'll start with you.
I'm going to bring up a scene from a movie that I like, The Matrix Reloaded. I don't know if you've seen that. Most people probably have seen that film. They were down in the basement of Zion looking at, I think it's a water purification system. And the councilman said, I have no idea how it works, but I know that it has something to do with our clean water supply. So that's always been a haunting concern, is that a lot of curriculum, again, I'm academic, we oftentimes don't see students who get exposure to things like continuum mechanics or numerical methods or constitutive modeling in their curriculum, but they're given a tool very early on because it's on the computer network and they're computer savvy and can do a CAD type drawing and they can develop a model. They know what soil properties are, but they don't understand kind of how the software works. It's just like your car. I mean, I happen to be a gearhead, so I know a lot about cars, but many people don't. So they just, it's like the archetypal group of guys with the hood up looking at the car on the side of the road and nobody knows what's going on with it. It's just broken down. So we oftentimes don't know what's under the hood of the vehicle. It's under the hood of the finite element or the finite difference or the numerical software. Does that disqualify someone from using the tool because they can't explain to me a shape function? They can't explain to me how it works. I remember, early on, you could never publish a paper purely on a finite element model of a project. You always got a lot of trouble, a lot of very critical comments on finite element modeling as a research area. So I don't know. I do think we are at the point that a lot of people do use the software, and it is a black box. It is, here's a problem, it does the computation, and we have an output, and they're going to have to trust that output because they don't know. They're not operating in a level they can go back and pick it apart and understand what is right and what is wrong. And you don't ever want to be right for the wrong reason. And that's the tough thing that you could run into. So that's my opinion. I do think that we're in the point where we're having to trust the software so much
and we just don't have the level of training you would need to have to understand how it truly operates.
Thank you, Brian. All right, Augusto, you get the last word in this round.
Yeah.
So I'm going to pose the same question to you.
Yeah. So I agree with Brian. I see myself a disconnect between, let's say, the capability of the software, what the software can do. And, everybody can kind of set up a model, but the interpretation of the model, the model in the software is in between the data that you have, the engineering problem that you have to solve, and the output. And that is where our, let's say, expertise comes in. What data is a good data set, and what should we do with the data, and how do we need to interpret the results? What need to go into the garbage, and what can be considered valid? Let's face it, this is true for every method. You can take a closed form solution for a settlement calculation or a green constant for a calculation of bearing capacity. If you don't know what is the friction angle, and you have no idea what is the level of strain for the friction angle that should go there, then it's garbage in, garbage out. So in any model or any approach, you need to know what you're doing. That is not let's say, a fault of the software. It's always or the differential equation or the closed form solution that you plug into Excel is always our understanding of the problem and our limitation in terms of the interpretation of the data set and the results. So that is my, but yeah, I do see a disconnect between, and I'm not sure what will be the best answer other than experience and develop a lot of sensitivity.
Very good. Excellent. So that's the end of round one, and it's time to take a short break. Okay, we're back with Brian and Augusto for round two. Gentlemen, there is a quote from the eminent Professor Ralph Peck, and it goes something like this: if you cannot reduce a difficult engineering problem to just one 8.5 by 11 inch sheet of paper, you will probably never understand it. Brian, let me start with you. What do you think Dr. Peck meant by this?
Well, again, movies are a theme of mine. The movie Contact, great movie. One of the statements made in Contact was about Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually the controlling. So I've, in some respects, I think that's what Professor Peck meant, was that, most of the time when we can boil things down to fairly simple concepts that are based on limiting equilibrium, Hooke's law, things that we should fairly well understand. And if we can simplify the problem into more global pieces, you can begin to understand it, understand where the stresses are going, where we would expect there to be a problem that needs further investigation. I think that's probably what he meant, is that maybe from a global level, you could boil it down that way. I will make a caveat to that statement, though, that,
okay.
We also, because we didn't have more complicated solutions or more complex ways to tackle problems, we didn't tackle some of those problems. Problems that Peck and Terzaghi dealt with, while complex in some respects, are things that we routinely deal with now, are far more complicated than some of the things that they dealt with in their careers. So I would qualify the statement in that I do agree that we can look at it, and we need to be able to simplify these problems down so we understand that when we do use a numerical tool, that the numbers are making sense, because we think this is where the stress concentration is, where the most settlement's going to be. But we are able to tackle more complicated problems. So it might be 2 sheets of 8.5 by 11 paper now. So.
Well, that you brought that up, and I want to just ping this off of you. I think it used to be in engineering, and it may be still today, but you don't hear it said explicitly. But I think it used to be in the day where there were gaps in our knowledge, or there were, let's just say, things that were too complex to analyze, we tended to try to control those in a way that now our simplified solution applied to it. So we simplify, or we controlled the environment, or we controlled the design. And I think now that even that philosophy is lost. We run up against a very complex problem, and now we do have the tools, and we apply very more complex tools without even the thought that we can control the environment. Does that make sense, what I said?
Oh yeah, yeah, and you're backing up against the observational method, where in their day they could just start working and design on the fly, and that's more difficult in modern contracting environment to do that. So yes, I agree that they also had a lot of latitude to work in a space that they didn't know, they didn't have the technology for. So numerical models does allow us to think differently about these problems. So like I said, I have a halfway answer on that one, but I agree with what you're saying too.
Very good. All right, Augusto, do you agree with Dr. Peck?
I also have kind of a double feeling about this. One, that sheet of paper is a decent size to make a list of things that I don't know and things that I want to investigate. On the second side of it is sometimes our biases and our limitation of understanding of the reality might trick us. Might trick in a way that we pretend that we can understand how a complex system behaves and where the stress would go and how the complex reaction would develop, while I've been surprised multiple times, kind of doing guesswork at the beginning. This is the system, this is the way I think it will behave. And I was finding significantly different answer with my analysis. And I just kind of go back to the learning process and using numerical tool as a lab to investigate the behavior. So again, if the system is relatively simple and can be boiled down to, let's say, a mostly axial component, mostly bending component, or whatever, we have a good understanding. But when the system is relatively complex in terms of deformation involved with different components, then it becomes, I would say, probably too pretentious from at least from my side, to feel that I can simplify or understand the full spectrum of the response. I probably don't. And I would rather do and investigate it further. So again, it's a good starting point to have a feeling, but I don't think the answer should be limited and biased too much, at least at the beginning, from our biases.
Well, Augusto, we had a really good talk at the end of round one that in between these rounds, and I kind of want to delve further in what we talked about.
Yeah,
I'm just going to paint a picture here. So let's paint a picture of a numerical modeler or someone who wants to apply numerical modeling, and they get tasked with creating a model, and they go from 0 to 100 miles an hour. So they've got a building, and they've got piles, and then they apply an earthquake, and then they have an excavation, and they go from 0 to 100. They push the button, and it gives them an answer. And they say, there it is. That's the answer. That's how much it's going to deflect, or that's my factor of safety. And they write a report and they send it off. Okay. The discussion that you and I had was a very different discussion about numerical modeling than that. And yes. We kind of used the term that you called it just then, you called it a lab.
Yes.
You also said it was a chance to look at your patient. Another way to look at it would be, it's like building your building ahead of time and then trying to see how it would react before you build it.
Yes.
Could you describe for us right now? I think that'd be very helpful. to contrast your modeling compared to the person that says, I'm going to model reality. I'm going to hit the button, get the answer, and go to my client?
Yeah, so the approach that I usually take when I have to deal with a complex problem, it's you have to apply the KISS principle every time. And you have to start with a simple, relatively simple model, even crude model, to try to investigate the basic physics. Is an excavation? If I remove this volume, is the model responding uplifting? Really the basic understanding and the basic reaction of the model should be there. I'm not even talking about your complex constitutive model for now. You can start with a simple Moore Coulomb, just an elastic modulus, a couple of strength parameters, use your SPT, your error limit to estimate, build a simple geometry, a crude mesh that run in 15 minutes at maximum, even 5 minutes, and do some preliminary investigation. Once you kind of have a feeling for what's going on, then you can start implementing more complicated elements. Refine the mesh, refine the pile elements, add the pile elements, complete the excavation process, add details to whatever is the basic that you have already framed in your model. If you start with everything in it, it's very likely that you're going to get lost. You're going to miss the fundamental behavior and get really lost into the details and chasing the little minutiae that are probably not so important, and it will confuse you. If you have a reviewer in front of you that will start our questions and you're not able to answer, what is the logic that you have implemented, and how do you go from 0 to 100, then you're going to lose also your credibility.
Very good.
Again, the numerical tool, it's really, I see it and I feel it and I apply it as a lab. It's a virtual lab.
Very nice. Okay, Brian, you've heard Augusto. You deal with students all the time. Certainly, and some of them, I imagine, use advanced software like numerical modeling. What's your sense? Are they in tune with Augusto, or do they approach it naturally in a different way? Tell us your experience.
They quickly can get dangerous. That's the thing, that students are fast learners. They will take something and oftentimes run very quickly with it. However, again, I think that we don't do enough, and it really depends on the direction of like, say, a master's student or a PhD student, especially. It's difficult to get a lot of depth in numerical techniques unless that's specifically what you're focusing on, and you may end up in mechanical engineering or aerospace or something. And in civil, we do not teach that much depth. So you might get 1 or 2 classes that help explain this. So I do routinely sit in on doctoral dissertation defenses and in geotechnical and structural engineering, as well as even master's theses where students are using these tools. And I ask very pointed questions about, did you validate your model? Did you start from a simple model? Do you know if it's right? How do you know if it's right? And we really endeavor to train the students to start with a very simple model. I've got some closed form solutions in Lamb and Whitman's book that I'll say, I won't believe your software until you can replicate this closed form solution and show me that it does that at a minimum. Because otherwise, you could be right for the wrong reasons. I've said that before. You could think you're right for the wrong reasons. So learning to be skeptical of what you are calculating is extremely important. You've got to be able to take the results and go back and peel back the layers, understand what's going on, and definitely never just run the analysis and hand it over and say, I'm done. You've got to go back and do some of your own personal post-processing so you can quality assure what you've produced. So
Brian, I'm going to ask you to expand on that just a little bit. So, it does sound to me like when you talk to most of your students that they have the perception that they are, let's just say there's like one unique solution. Like you gave them this task, and as long as they follow the numerical steps, they will get one solution, and that is the correct one. And I think what I'm hearing from Augusto is that he approaches numerical modeling a little bit different, that he almost views it as a way to better understand behavior. And it's almost like the numerical modeling is just another tool to hone his judgment as opposed to coming up with a unique solution. Do you think number one, let me step over to Augusto real quick. Augusto, am I onto something here? Is that true?
Yep. Yes, it is.
I mean, you're using numerical modeling as a lab to hone your judgment, but do our students do that, Brian?
Well, I think we are trying to rise them to that level.
Okay.
Because I think we're training them. This is their first exposure, and that, students are used to doing homework problems that have an answer, I grade it, and then give them a grade on it. That's their mentality as they come through school, is that the answer is right or wrong. But then as they begin to advance, like I will say, well, why don't you do a parametric study on this? Because truly the variation of this parameter, its natural variation is this amount. You might need to do a study and see how sensitive your model is to that. And that's a level of evolution that students, if they truly mature as modelers, can get to and should aspire to being, to using it as a lab more than just a right or wrong tool. It just depends on how far we can get them in that education process. So.
I'm gonna tell a quick story, and it doesn't even involve numerical modeling, but it goes back to this concept of us using our tools to hone our judgment. I just had a project. It was in California, and I'm not going to be more specific than that, but it came down to how much settlement occurred after a liquefaction event. And it seemed like, and I think it was true at the end of the day, the discussion was in terms of 1/10 of an inch. And to satisfy the criteria, it wanted to see a piece of software that computed a certain number to 1/10 of an inch. So it was painful for me to watch it go on, but it didn't have anything to do with numerical modeling, but it did have with this concept that, judgment aside, I want to see a calculation that shows a level of precision that there is absolutely no way anybody could justify. And it was it was scary.
Well, and I think you hit on an important point, is you evolve, and some early on you'll see students who believe it down to 3 decimal points.
Yeah, well, that.
And you got to say, well, wait a minute, how precise was your measurement of the friction angle? How precise were any of these other inputs into
how precise is knowing the earthquake? How?
Yeah. And then say, so if you're within 1/2 of an inch, maybe,
yeah.
So yeah, and that again, that comes down to maturity and students who are, at least on our end, trying to open their eyes to understand it as, again, the tool in the toolbox, and how do you effectively use that tool. And it's not like the buttons on your calculator, hit the plus sign and you're done, So I definitely agree with your observation there, Tim. So.
Very good, Brian. Well, thank you. All right, well, that's the end of round 2. All right, Lucky, I want you to chime in. How do you see this thing going?
Well, they're doing fantastic. I really love the choice of our speakers today, because I think Augusto is talking about the experience being in the industry for so long and using the software for so long. And Brian is talking about the students who start, getting exposed when they are in colleges, and what happens next? How do they process it? I still remember, first week of my soil mechanics class in University of Texas, my professor, the first sentence he told us was, "What if imagine you being an earthworm, ability to go into the soil ground and look at the grains and assess how you can design the structure above you." We can't do that, right? We definitely can't do that. So I mean, over a period of time, the softwares and everything has come along very, very far. And I remember the first job I had too. Some of the points that Augusto and Brian and you have raised, I remember it was not even numerical modeling, but AllPile, LPile, and those softwares for design a foundation. My manager would, when I take the report to him and the analysis to him, he would specifically ask me, "Where is your hand calculations?" He wanted me to understand, do you understand the software? Do you understand what the numbers you're putting in and what the numbers you're getting out? If your calculation and your software does not match, then you probably did not design it properly. That actually taught me a lot. I thought he was just, really giving me a lot of pain, but that was not correct. It took me a while to understand. So I think they have raised amazing points, amazing insighters for students, to become what they can for future using numerical modeling. This is amazing. And I don't see scratches on both of them. So I'm hoping there will be a
That's
little
right.
more, a little more mean in round 3. Let's see. Bring it on, both of you.
All right. All right. Maybe we'll get a little bit more fireworks this final round.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucky. All right, gentlemen. Here we are in the third and the final round. I'm going to give you my unscientific and purely anecdotal opinion that it seems like each generation relies more heavily on computers and probably more heavily on technology than previous generations. And I think this is also true in geotechnical engineering and the use of numerical modeling. Again, it's just want to warn you, it's purely my opinion. There was probably a time when numerical modeling was, it would be a person that graduated with a Ph.D. and probably developed a model, such as some of the old programs like FEDAM or SEEP, that would be hired particularly to run that numerical model. But now there are certainly plenty of masters and maybe even undergraduates that when they graduate, their employer asks them to be a modeler, if they've got, they're going to purchase a product like Plaxis or FLAC or one of the other software that's available, and say, "Hey, we would like you to run this for the problem, for one of our problems." Augusto, give us a little bit of, you're talking to this young person, and you had mentioned, you had said a few things like humility, know what you don't know. Tell us some of the things that you would tell this young aspiring modeler when they start.
Well, first of all, I would ask him or her to outline the thought process. Where do you start to outline really the critical thinking of it? For example, it is a foundation or it is a slope problem, whatever that is. I want to see a series of steps that are coherent from point A to point B and are making sense. Then what about the data?
When you say making sense, tell me, maybe be more specific. Someone, is that the validation process that we're talking about?
Yeah, somehow I see. For example, going back to high-level PhD, or people that tend to start too complicated, that tend to start to or think or to implement since the beginning stuff that are too complicated, even for the data set that we have, that we are not even to be able to control what's going on under the hood. So I would, again, I'm going back to the KISS principle. I want to have an outline of the steps, data, constitutive model that we're going to use. How do we model the structural components? What sensitivity are we going to use? Let's figure out what is or what are the parameters that are controlling the behavior. This is a service limit state that we need to pay attention to? Are we mostly focused on the final, let's say, limit equilibrium or final state, ultimate state for the structure? So what is really the thought process that is developing? And then start gathering the information, put the information in an organization, select a constitutive model with increasing level of let's say complications, but let's start simple as well. And then a lot of interpretation of the results, like, look at the results. Why, for example, if the deformation is higher in this point or is lower in this other one. Let me give you a very simple example. Let's suppose that we have a retaining wall, a diaphragm wall, a multi-anchor diaphragm wall, and we have an excavation, let's say 10 meters, 30 feet. And we have an SPT, and with the SPT profile, we come up with a shear wave velocity profile and with an elastic modulus profile. What I've seen multiple times doing is, I want to be conservative for the selection, for the settlement evaluation or the displacement evaluation behind the wall. I'm going to choose a relatively low elastic modulus. But I also need to pay attention to the structural component. If I do that, I tend to have more of rigid movement of the diaphragm wall, which an underestimation of the rotation and the deflection of the diaphragm wall, and therefore the bending moment. So on one side, I might be conservative on the geotechnical aspect, but I may not be conservative on the structural aspects, because the elastic modulus, or the modulus in general, the deformability of the soil, plays a role into the development of the bending moment and the structural stress result that are inside the element that we are designing to. So I want to see this connection. Why are picking one value and is conservative for one, but I have to pay attention also to the other components. So that's why I cannot really separate, I am a geotechnical engineer, I'm doing only the geotechnical, I'm the structural guy, so I'm going to do all the structure. We are talking about soil structural interaction. We need to understand both. We need to have a feeling for what's going on when we pick up one parameter or the other one. And this is a simple type of approach. And I see this aspect, this lack of understanding of these basic aspects very often.
So I kind of want to examine this a little bit. Let's just say let's look at your example of a retaining system, like you just said. If someone, and you've been doing it for years, Augusto. So, but let's just say I'm aspiring numerical modeler, and maybe I'm 3 years out of school, and someone comes with a retaining wall. Would it be unreasonable to expect, or for my, would it be unreasonable to say, okay, I'm going to just simply see if I can predict an at-rest pressure and just do a very simple model, or predict a passive pressure and see how that compares to a textbook value, in just a way for me to understand fundamentally the relationship in soil strength? Would that be something that someone new would, to that level?
Yeah, it's certainly one route that we can take, although if we're still thinking about the specific problems before getting into the passive mobilization of the reaction, your structure that is sitting on top of the wall has already gone. Okay, so it is again let's say an understanding of what level of information do we need to have in order to mobilize the passive reaction. I can get into there, but
I wasn't really talking about necessarily even, but I would think that if you are going to represent, or me, any or that person going to represent in a numerical modeler, they need to move into something more complex, like you just talked about, a diaphragm wall, with absolute confidence that they could at least come up with some reasonable bounds of what they intended to with a very simple wall. I'm not suggesting that there's a passive aspect to this design. I'm just saying that you would think that because I've done enough modeling to know that I could build a mesh or model, and then when I apply it, I don't get anything at all like what our conventional practice, and usually what ends up with is that I've made some aspect of my model that is a problem. You see where I'm going with that?
Yeah, what I'm trying to say is that is a starting point. If we want to, for example, Phil talk about the retaining wall and see what if the passive failure that I'm getting with, or the passive force pressure that I'm getting with the friction angle is okay. But in my perspective, that is not enough. It doesn't tell the story that we are going to face in reality, because that is an abstraction. That is a limit state. And
I see what you're saying, but at least it gives me the confidence that I am getting what I think I'm getting, or think I should be getting, right?
Yeah. Again, it's a starting point, but just be aware that because the passive pressure checks, the design might still be completely wrong.
Sure, I'm totally get that. Right? No, I was not. I was just simply using it because there are two limit states that someone reasonably could model, right? That they could say they could move the wall out from the retained earth and see a reduction in earth pressure and vice versa. But that's all I wanted to.
If I can just jump in for 30 seconds, because I think this is important. I feel that in our industry, there is way too much focus on ultimate state. And this is true for slope stability, this is true for foundation, this is true for excavation. And we tend to neglect or put on the back burner the service limit state, and which is really the controlling. Because let's face it, if you have a roadway that move 3 inches and you go out of service, limit equilibrium is not even invoked yet, but you cannot drive on top of it. And you have to close the highway.
Augusto, let's circle back. Let's get Brian involved. But your
point.
Sorry,
I got carried away.
That's all right. But your point, we'll come back to it. Brian, let me get you in here. Would you agree with me? And we're going back to students and young engineers. Would you agree with me that they are drawn to numerical modeling more than ever? And I guess I'd also ask you and you've kind of touched on it, but what would your recommendation or your advice be to them if they want to pursue that as a big part of their career?
Well, I want to say yes. I see more people drawn. I think there's several reasons. I think
we'll throw them out there.
It goes back to what you said before. It's the latest and greatest. It's cool. We love our computers. We love our big screens, and they produce great multicolored graphs and outputs and heat plots and things that you can show your boss and be very impressive when he asks for an analysis, or they ask for an analysis. So people are very, it's exciting. It's something that's neat. It gives you pages and reams of output that you can look productive with at times. So I do think we're drawn. I think that the way our industry has shifted in the past 20 years of my career is more and more faculty are numerical modelers. There's quite a.
I was going to touch on that, and I wanted to. I mean, I think am I right? Am I right that the part of the reason for that is that's something that doesn't require a lot of money to pursue in terms of research. I mean, you have to have the software, but it's not like you're building full-size foundations, or you're not putting in very, very expensive instrumentation. I mean,
you're talking to a person that does that, and it's tough, and I can get, sometimes it's difficult to get a lot of published work out of a lot of effort when you do load testing and instrumentation, but I just love it. That's what I like to do. It's very easy when you're making models and developing things and sitting in a computer. I'm being facetious to an extent.
Oh,
so please,
to say
not
it's
to offend
easy,
my
right,
modeling colleagues,
but
still,
maybe it's within your
it's-
more. You could certainly
yeah.
say it's within more in your control.
Yeah.
If you're installing a test shaft, it could take a week, or it could take 10 weeks, and it's all outside your control.
Yeah.
But at least with a numerical model, you're like, hey, it's raining today, I can do my numerical model, rain or shine.
Well, and so we see a lot more young people coming through, especially graduate programs, and their advisors are numerical modelers. So you become a numerical modeler because that's what you're exposed to.
Yeah.
And we're seeing, finite element, finite difference, discrete element. You see all of that, those flavors now, and people are using, they're just becoming those experts. So yes, we're definitely seeing more of that. My wish for the students and the young professionals is get your hands on case histories that are simple, things that people have spent a lot of time measuring and testing, and use those and make your own models. Those are your closed form solutions. Oftentimes find really nicely published case studies, model it, do it on the side, develop your trust in that software with something that someone has already done and documented, rather than having to put a lot of faith in the patient that you're simulating. There's a lot of good case studies in the literature that many folks have really worked hard to publish. Get that information. If it's a pile load test, if it's a retaining wall, if it's a footing, there's a lot of work at Texas A&M on footings. There's so many things out there. That's where you can really hone your skills. You can develop your trust in your software. Don't just take it for face value. Sit in every class, go to a short course on the software, something, try to peek behind the curtain and see if Oz is back there, and see what's going on behind the scenes, because that's the way you'll become the master modeler, in my opinion, is when you know really what's going on. You might could task someone with building the mesh and everything, but if you really want to be the person that knows what's going on, that's it. Again, don't be right for the wrong reasons. Don't trust something just because. I sit on a lot of, and that, we really hold our students here at Auburn to, when you are doing a numerical thesis or dissertation, you need to validate. You've got to prove to us that that what you did was correct, or at least it has a good chance of being correct. How's that? So
that's great. Okay, so we're getting kind of near the end of our show, but Brian, while you're talking, I thought of first I thought that was excellent, but I also thought of something that I've experienced firsthand, and it is I've been in several expert cases where a high level academic, or maybe even a high level, a practicing engineer, uses a numerical model as a way of first gaining, I think, trying to gain an advantage for the client by either showing them a mode of failure or or support for their client's case. But also what I've noticed is that it's instant credibility to the public. The model looks beautiful. It looks like it looks like a George Jetson cartoon, which we all know is found in fact, rooted in fact. Being a little facetious there, but so we've got these issues. We've got numerical modeling that it can mislead you with answers if you don't calibrate it. It could be used as kind of a club or a weapon to beat the other person in maybe and take advantage of its credibility in a court case. It can actually probably retard some folks from developing good analytical skills by relying upon numerical modeling as opposed to using other tools such that are, closed form solutions that have been out there for many years and pretty reasonable at coming up with, to hone your judgment. Let's look. Would you put the misuse of numerical modeling, and I'm going to ask you both this question, would you put the misuse of numerical modeling, let's just say, is one of the top 10 problems that we face in geotechnical engineering? Maybe the top 20. I don't know. Maybe you're not even on your list as you reflect. So I'll give you guys both a few minutes to think about that. And maybe you'll, and certainly if you think of, and this might be a part where Augusto gets to mention the use of limit state versus service state. I'll kind of give you guys some free range here to talk about it. But my main question is, would you put the misuse of numerical modeling near the top? And you've got some opportunity to expand on that. Brian, you go first.
I'm going to put it in the top 10. Maybe near the top 5, but in the top 10. I'm going to quote geophysicists here. You ask a geophysicist what the answer is, and they'll say, well, what do you want it to be? And that's oftentimes a perception, is that someone can produce a numerical model to tell exactly what you want. So like going into court, there are all these different scenarios that you could examine, and for various reasons, the model could point towards one or two or very different failure points or critical points. And a lot of times it's the interpretation or convincing someone to pay attention to one part of the model and not the other. And whether it's a court case or even research, sometimes we're distracted by what's in front of us, and that we need to look further. And what was actually the problem was in the background. It wasn't in the foreground, and we just didn't pay attention to it. So, and whether or not, again, it's used purposefully to distract, or if we just didn't know enough to pay attention to it. So I think that, and I think it's a very broad basket, a broad brush to paint with as far as numerical modeling in general. But I think issues with interpretation, issues with just being better prepared and better qualified to implement the models and interpret the models is definitely a top 10 issue that we face. And I think it's only going to get more complicated. I hate to say that. I mentioned earlier that machine learning is taking us by storm. And at some point, it's going to be removing the human element even more from numerical modeling. Like you'll scan something and you won't be building the mesh will be auto-generated and other things. And trying to keep that judgment in there as long as we need that. So I think it's even more critical that we understand as much as we can about what's behind the curtain. So again, I'm going to leave it in the top 10, and maybe it could work its way to the top 5. So. All
right, Brian, thank you. All right, Augusto, I'm being a little bit unfair here because I've already made numerical modeling casted as misuse of the numerical modeling. So don't take offense to that, but tell me what you think. Would you even put it up there?
Let me step back a little bit. I'm not sure in which position, at what position I would put it. I kind of have a general issue with this framework in general, kind of putting numerical modeling as the problem of geotechnical engineering in general.
Wait, now
what
carefully, I chose my words carefully. I said the misuse of it
yeah,
is the
no,
problem.
No.
I
But
wasn't trying to incriminate all of
totally,
them.
yeah. And I'm just touching and reconnecting to that word, which is very well chosen, which is misuse, because you can misuse everything. You have a closed form solution, usually is developed for boundary conditions that are very simple. They're not based on reality. And why would you think that in a real problem, if you don't have the correct boundary condition, a closed form solution would give you the right answer? Usually there are correction factor or ignorance factor to be able to apply a closed form solution to a realistic problem, because you don't know if the boundary conditions are appropriate or not. And so that kind of ties into misuse of everything. The approach and the adoption of ultra simplistic strategies is problematic as well, because it's giving us the wrong answer. So it goes both ways in many directions. And in my opinion, it boils down to the capacity of being selective and understanding what we are doing and being aware of the limitation. I do feel that sometimes numerical modeling, advanced numerical model is misused, but I also see that very simplistic numerical tools are misused as well.
Augusto, but I would say that the slight difference there is, and maybe this is true in some cases, not true in others, but there is an inherent, in many cases, or in some cases, there's an inherent credibility that is given to numerical modeling that other processes don't necessarily share. And I think it's because of its ability to come across so clear, concise, and representative, and that's a credit to it. But at the same, if I were to do settlement calculations of a pile group, for example, and I did them by hand, I would put those, I think someone would go through them and try to, if it were like a third party viewer, they would go through and they would very carefully look at each step and question and calculate. But if it were a numerical model of the three group, there'd be very few people that could go through that. And I think there would be a lot of, I think because of the kind of the robust presentation, a lot of times the numerical model isn't reviewed as closely. And that's not the, I mean, I think that's just the reality that we're in. And that's kind of why I say that anything could be misused, but they all don't have that level of credibility that numerical modeling does to accompany it.
If I could,
yeah. Go ahead, Brian.
I was just going to interject and agree with Tim that you see this quite a bit, that if someone doesn't understand the analysis, they may take it for face value. Whereas if they understand the analysis, they will pick it to pieces. So it is something, and that's a challenge back to our profession to make sure that we are fair in that respect. So,
well, if I may, I've been on the opposite side multiple times, where the model is challenged with simplistic approaches, and the model is providing more elaborate and more sophisticated type of, let's say, mechanism that the simplistic approach cannot capture. And so this has been kind of a consider, like most disadvantage in many circumstances, because it doesn't provide the same answer that you would get with a limited equilibrium analysis, for example. And you have to go through an ordeal of process to try to justify what a simplistic analysis or simplistic tool cannot capture in reality. And so it could go both ways. In many times, in many circumstances, in my experience, it has been a disadvantage instead of being an advantage. Because on the other side, I had people that are really entrenched into their methodology, and it's been very difficult to try to show that the reality could be a little bit more complex than just checking forces. And that deformation is not correct. And that is a struggle that we still face in our industry. And it's really about it.
Very good.
So that's it.
Thanks, Augusto. Well, there we are. That's the end of our match for today. Augusto and Brian, thank you so much. This was excellent. All right, Lucky.
It's my pleasure.
I think they did fantastic, Tim. They did fantastic. I love their passion they have for numerical modeling, and also the valuable advice and valuable points that they brought in, in the third and the fourth round. I just love it. When we started the first round, I think it was Augusto who said, and I think Tim, you chimed in as well. We said basic understanding of mechanical and fundamental aspects of the project is very important to understand numerical modeling, right? And going from aspiring numerical modeler to a good modeler with experience takes a lot of effort. I still remember I had a coworker, this was so many years ago, and he was one of those engineers who did not enjoy going into the field. So he was very good at math, and he was very good at, writing code. So he just wanted to be a numerical modeler. So then I didn't think of it so much, but being in the industry for so long, I realized you can become that, but if you don't have the basic foundation of what soil is and what soil parameters mean to you to design, how difficult it is to become a good numerical modeler, right? And Brian also brought in some points about it. So that was amazing.
No, Lucky, you're right on. I remember when I was a young engineer, I sent away to get a triaxial test on sand, and the lab came back with 54 degrees. And I was frustrated. So I grabbed it, I went back, and I talked to our lab technician. And of course, it was a mess. But it just goes to show you that it's not, this was a conventional triaxial test. It had nothing to do with software, but it was abused. And had I not been able to think rationally and say, well, okay, 54 degrees is probably not the right answer, I could have easily passed it on to the client and whoever. I could have designed with it, but you still have to have those fundamentals to make sure that you're in the realm of reality. And I think Augusto and Brian brought that out very well.
Yeah, I have one question for you both. Very quick answer. I would like to hear, what is the future of numerical modeling in both your aspects? The reason I'm asking this is, industry and academia have to work together to advance the geotechnical industry. So I want to understand, Brian, what is future of numerical modeling for you? What is future of numerical modeling for you, Augusto?
I can go first. Like I mentioned before, I think things are changing rapidly. I think that students are going to be using more and more numerical models. They're going to come out with that experience. But I do think we're looking more towards machine learning and other things that are going to take over, at least work with numerical modeling, even take it over big data analysis, looking at phenomenological solutions that are based on data, not just on models. So things are changing, but even for now, though, the train's left the station. We're going to see a lot of numerical modeling from here on out. So.
Yeah, I totally agree. The future is brilliant. I see a significant trend toward the coupling of different methodology, like continuum mechanics, DM, particle codes colliding together to be able to capture different components of the behavior in general. That is quite a strong trend in many industry and in many software, and along with the big data that Brian was mentioning. So I believe there's a strong future.
All right, two questions for you. We talked about the fact that numerical modeling in its proper setting, it needs to be a tool in your toolbox to hone your judgment. Do you see that philosophy on the upswing, or do you find it disappearing? Augusto?
I believe it is going in that direction, and I'm working hard, very hard, to try to move it into that direction.
it's going to depend on guys like you and females like you, whichever, right? To do that. All right, Brian, how about you? You see it going in the right direction or wrong direction?
I'm doing everything in my power to make it happen.
All right.
I lay out the expectation that that's what we want students to walk away with. So,
well, that's the way to end this show, because that's really at the heart of it, and that's heart of engineering. That's excellent, gentlemen. I couldn't think of two better guests to talk about this topic. Thank you.
This is wonderful. This is wonderful. So this concludes the episode of DFI Rumble. Listeners, don't forget to comment who won in the arena. Was it an engineer or the professor or the industry? Thank you.
On behalf of DFI, we hope you enjoyed this episode. The views, information, and opinions expressed during Deep Foundation Institute's podcasts are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of DFI. DFI does not verify or take responsibility for the accuracy of the information contained, nor does it warrant that the information contained herein is suitable for any general or specific use. The podcast is available for private, non-commercial use only. Editing, modification, or redistribution of this podcast is prohibited. Sponsored by ECA. Thanks for your time. Keep on surviving.